Right now we only have about 16 attendees. Should we give them a little time or should we go ahead and start?
Let's go ahead and start.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Increasing Farm to Institution in Kansas. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items with the technology. My name is Valerie Black, and I'm the IT specialist with the Kansas Health Foundation. What I'd like for you to know is when you look at your screen, if you have questions, we ask that you please type them in the chat box and make sure that organizers and panelists only are selected so that you send those questions to the panelists so that they can accurately respond. Also, if everyone who has joined the meeting, you're in mute mode. And so we ask that if you have any questions or concerns, please send them through the chat so that we won't have any kind of audio interference. With that being said, I'll turn it over to Jeff Usher, Program Officer with the Kansas Health Foundation.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. Today we're going to have Natasha Frost and Mary Merrow from both staff attorneys from the Public Health Law Center and Ashley Jones-Weisner, State Policy Manager for KC Healthy Kids. They're here to talk about Increasing Farm to Institution in Kansas report that the Public Health Law Center just released. So with that, I'll turn it over to Natasha. Natasha.
Great, thanks, Jeff. We are so excited to be able to roll out a recently completed report on farm to institution and have Ashley on the line to really talk about the practical implications of how to use this resource. And so the goal for today is to really walk you through the resource, the specifics, and Mary and I are going to do that. And then have Ashley really talk practically about how advocates around the state of Kansas can use the resource to really build the momentum to bring locally sourced products to institutions like local government sites, schools, and childcare facilities. So just for those of you who don't know who we are, the Public Health Law Center is an organization that helps kids like my nephew Drew eat strawberries and kale. And the way that we do that is through helping support you all do the hard work of creating policies and systems and an environment for healthy food like strawberries and kale. And so we provide legal research on a variety of topics specific to Kansas to help the food system and the food environment really foster fresh fruits and vegetables as well as other healthy food items and locally sourced items. We help with policy development. For example, we've been doing a lot of work in Kansas related to farm and food task forces at the local level. And we have several publications and trainings available for you all as you're doing your food system work. We do not provide direct representation or lobbying through the Public Health Law Center. And really our focus is to try and help frame policy issues related to the food system in a way that actually creates equitable access to food. And so the idea would be that everyone has what they need through policies and systems to reach that apple, to reach that healthy and locally sourced food option. And so that's really the frame that we're trying to accomplish with our technical assistance. And as part of that effort, we heard you loud and clear over the past 3 years that we've worked in Kansas that you're really interested in bringing locally sourced food to institutions in Kansas. And so we contracted with folks from Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic to really dive into this issue. And we're really lucky because our work is actually funded through the Kansas Health Foundation. And so we've developed a really deep partnership with the foundation to try and identify resources and technical assistance that's going to support you. And so this is just one of the many ways that we've done that. And so this resource is like a lengthy policy brief that really goes through what farm to institution is, why you should do it, and how do you do it, and focusing on 3 different settings: farm to agency, farm to school, and then farm to preschool. So throughout the document, we really use the word local food procurement, and for any of you who sat through a wonderful presentation on key messaging from Voices for Healthy Kids. People hear local food procurement and they do what my niece Jaya does quite often when we're talking about, Amy and I are talking, and kind of falls asleep just sitting there. So really when we're talking about local food procurement, what we really mean is healthier local food choices for public places. And those public places are governmental agencies, so the courthouse, or it could be the local school district or schools, or our preschool facilities. So that's kind of what we're talking about today. So I want to start with farm to agency. Farm to agency, what that means very simply is increasing local food purchasing by public agencies. So that could be at the state level, or it could be at the local level. And so this resource really walks through what the Kansas state requirements are related to when the state purchases food. So when the Department of Education is purchasing food, or when those state agencies are really focused on sourcing their food or other sorts of services. And so the document really walks through things that impact those decisions. One of the first laws that we identify is called the Randolph-Shepard Act. So the Randolph-Shepard Act is a federal law that gives vendors who are legally blind such a priority over other vendors to operate concession services or venue facilities on most federal property. And each state, including Kansas, has a similar law that extends that preference to state property or other governmental property. And so this document kind of walks through what those requirements are very, in a very succinct way. We also go through some of the state requirements for competitive bidding. And so here's how the state of Kansas kind of lays out their procurement or their purchasing policies. There's a Department of Administration, and they have an Office of Procurement and Contracts. And that really governs state procurement of goods and services. And they have a couple of sections, including the Department of Corrections, who have their own policies related to purchasing different goods and services. But the law relating through that, according to the law related to competitive bidding, is that competitive bids shall be awarded to the lowest responsible bidder, taking into consideration other specifications in terms of delivery and other conditions in the bid. And this is really important when we're talking about locally sourcing food, because that state law really impacts how local food is treated in that section, the pecking order for which bid will be considered and what priority is given to a particular vendor. And there are exceptions to this general rule at the state level that this document really walks you through. So you don't have to become an expert in competitive bidding to work at the state level related to getting food onto public property, but this resource really can help support your understanding and give you a really bird's eye view onto that process. The resource also goes through what's called a resident bidder preference, and this is really important when it comes to sourcing local food, because Kansas has this residential bidder preference, and that's a concept where the state agency, when they're purchasing goods and services, if the price is equal, so everything else is equal, the state agency is actually required to favor the goods from a Kansas bidder over the goods from an out-of-state bidder. And this resource really walks you through that process. Now, it sounds really great, and you're like, wow, we've already got locally sourcing in Kansas. There are limitations to the way this is laid out in Kansas law. The resident bidder preference actually only requires that the bidder be Kansas-based, not that the goods or services are actually grown, made, or manufactured in the state of Kansas. And so there is this great policy lever at the state level, but it does have limitations when we're talking about trying to source local food, locally grown food in our state agencies. So the last thing that we go through that is a key policy to understand is this idea of reciprocal preference. And that's really related to our bidder preference. And I am not going to go into detail into it today because it's a complicated legal structure that we lay out, and we have a chart in the document for you. But it's to understand that, Kansas is Kansas residents are actually given preference not only under the resident visitor preference, but also in the reciprocal preference law. And the idea is that if you're from another state and you bid on something, and you bid against somebody who is a Kansas resident, the person outside of Kansas actually has a higher, they actually are considered to have a higher amount on their contract. And there's a chart that goes through the exact way that this is calculated in the document. And, you know, those are really important if you're working at the state level, but I think many of you are actually really focused on ensuring that local governments, in fact, are the ones that are incorporating these key components of local source foods. And so this research really talks about what that might look like at the local level, talking about local authority. And I just want to pause here for just a note of caution on using this resource. This resource actually talks about the current state of the law in Kansas. And as many of you may know, there is a bill, AB 2595, that is a preemptive bill, and what that means is it takes the control away from local government and really calls into question some of the purchasing decisions that we've laid out here as options for local government. And so I really just want to make sure that people on this webinar understand that under the existing law as of today, March 16, 2016, there are some great opportunities to embed local sourcing components into local law to really promote the economic and health benefits of sourcing locally. But there is this AB 2595 that if it goes into effect, it's so broad and vague. For example, limiting a political subdivision and any restrictions for approved USDA products that are approved for sale by USDA, for example. It's so broad that it really could impact the efforts that you're working to source locally. So that's really important to understand. And then going back to the kind of what else is out there that might limit local government, the only state law currently that we were able to identify that impacts local government is really this reciprocal preference application. And so again, that's laid out in the resource for you to kind of dig into a bit. The other thing I will highlight at the local level is that the folks at the local level get their goods and services quite differently depending on which city or county agency you're working with. And so really understanding the complexities of that local level purchasing process is important. We go through a couple different examples that are really different. Even Olathe and Lawrence, the two very large cities in Kansas, they have very different purchasing practices, and that can impact your efforts at the local level pretty significantly, both in positive and negative ways. So just understanding the purchasing process across the local governments is important. So the main thing to keep in mind and use this research for is we lay out some recommendations. These are recommendations you will often know about, but it really synthesizes them for use of advocates to really kind of dig into the work at the local level. For example, this is the 5 kind of concepts that we identified. So educating farmers and agency purchasers about farm to institution opportunities is really critical, and this really is a theme throughout the entire, all the settings. Tracking food purchases, for example, is really, really important. And what that means is if you have local food purchases that are already occurring, really tracking when those local food purchases are happening so that you can really maximize and incentivize that moving forward and have that benchmark as well, or that's the tracking. And then instituting a benchmark kind of follows from that, where you have a percentage of the food purchased or a goal of an amount of food purchased at the local level, maybe 5%, maybe 10% of locally sourced goods. And again, I just want to remind you that that is an option under current law, but we have seen in other states like Mississippi that has that preemptive, real chilling effect and greatly minimize impact of the ability to institute some of these great policy options. to support locally sourced food. So right now, currently, there's some benchmark options that you can do under current law. So there's also this idea of utilizing this existing resident bidder policy, really using and maximizing that, extending it beyond just to Kansas residents and working to really extend that to other Kansas-grown, Kansas-made, or Kansas-manufactured products. Can go far beyond food, but really, thinking about how that could work locally because it's already in existence. And then really thinking about this idea of adopting a local food preference for local government purchasing through specific ordinances that, again, under current law is allowable and is a really useful tool, especially after you've created this path of understanding the local food environment. And actually, we'll talk a little more about the framing of what makes sense for your local government and making sure it's grounded in the feasibility nature, not setting up 50% food preference requirement at the local level probably is not your best first step. But really that last step of adopting that local food preference is a wonderful opportunity to really support local producers in the community, to support that health and economic vitality that really is the underpinning and backbone of farm-to-institution work. All right, passing it off to Mary.
Great. Thanks so much, Natasha. And I'm going to spend the next few minutes going over just some things that this new resource introduces and information that's provided about farm-to-school initiatives. And when I think about farm-to-institution and farm-to-school, for me anyway, this farm-to-school movement is perhaps the best known farm-to-institution initiative and has a really solid footing in a lot of places, not only in Kansas, but around the country. And so I think that sometimes if we're starting to think about expanding this farm-to-institution approach beyond schools, the experiences and lessons learned from farm-to-school initiatives can really provide some direction and inform other efforts as people are expanding into public institutions like Natasha mentioned, or hospitals, or we're going to be talking about childcare facilities, because I think that the school setting provides a unique glimpse, recognizing at the same time that K through 12 schools have a different legal framework and regulations that they're governed by than maybe some other institutions might have. And I'll be going over some of that a bit in the next few minutes. But one of the things I think that schools and local farmers and producers have learned is that farm-to-school initiatives and linking schools to local farmers can be a really effective way not to only support the local economy, but also to support educational goals and learning objectives of students at local schools, and also to introduce children to healthy food that they may not have tried before. In Kansas, one of the things that you'll see in this resource is that over I think 507 schools in 106 school districts across the state have participated in some form of farm-to-school effort. And they're finding, I think that during the 2011 to 2012 school year, the economic benefit of this kind of partnership between local schools and local producers was capped at about $2.27 million that was spent by Kansas schools on local products, primarily around vegetables and grain and flour products. But I know that there are schools that also work with local egg production or different meat producers and things, local producers in their farm-to-school initiatives. So while I think that a lot of initial farm-to-school initiatives may focus on some produce or some of those vegetable or grain products, there are a lot of other food products out there that could benefit from a farm-to-school approach. So another thing, too, before we get into some of the legal considerations, is that it's important to think about farm-to-school initiatives really broadly, because they can take different forms, and it doesn't need to be a really big endeavor if your school hasn't actually ventured into this area before. A farm-to-school effort could just be a one-time event, highlighting maybe a vegetable or crop that is being harvested at a certain time, or a farm to school effort can also be expanded to providing food regularly to the school food service program by incorporating local food in on a more regular basis. And then farm to school efforts can also include like educational opportunities by having farm visits to the farms that are providing some of the schools. And also some people, and I'm not sure how the conversation in Kansas is right now, but some people really see school garden initiatives as an extension or a component of farm to school efforts. So there's a wide range of ways that schools are exploring farm to school efforts, and so it's just important to keep an open mind and consider what might be a good fit for your context, and to not be overwhelmed or intimidated when thinking about venturing out into this area, because there's a lot of lessons learned and a lot of real great benefits that can come from this relationship. So going to the next slide. One of the things to keep in mind too from a regulatory perspective with farm to school efforts in Kansas is that there are two different regulatory agencies that may be involved in farm to school. So the Kansas Department of Education is definitely a core piece of the puzzle, because the Department of Education is basically the state agency who is responsible for kind of monitoring and supervising the federal child nutrition program. And so especially for farm to school programs that are providing, sourcing food for the federal child nutrition programs, which could be the school meal or breakfast programs or the fresh fruit and vegetable program, those kinds of initiatives, the Kansas Department of Education may be involved, and maybe they have some resources that can support your effort. And at the same time, with farm to school efforts, go to the next slide, the Kansas Department of Agriculture may also have some resources, either from some grant initiatives, as this slide indicates, or some technical assistance in maybe even identifying different local producers, like from the Kansas certification program for local producers. So the Kansas Department of Agriculture is also a really great resource for folks who may be interested in expanding or beginning a farm to school effort but aren't quite sure where to start. And so one of the nice things about farm to school is because it does have this educational piece and then also the agricultural piece, I think that there may be more opportunities for some technical assistance and support for your efforts than some other areas in the school environment. So I just encourage you to keep in mind some of the resources that are available to you. So when we're thinking about farm to school initiatives, I think it is really important to keep in mind that a farm to school initiative does operate within the context of the K through 12 kind of structure, and that there's a lot of regulatory considerations that could impact, like the provision of food for the school nutrition programs, and there may be curriculum requirements that could impact how you can work and use the farm to school program maybe to support some different educational goals. But there's three key pieces when we're thinking about the food piece that are involved in some capacity. So there's the Federal School Food Authority, and basically USDA is the federal agency that is has the oversight federally of the federal child nutrition programs. Again, that could be the school meal programs of lunch and breakfast, the fresh fruit and vegetable program, and some other snacks that are provided. And so if a school is involved in a federal child nutrition program and provides that benefit to their children, to their students, then USDA and the federal regulations governing the federal child nutrition programs have to be navigated. And ultimately how that impacts maybe a smaller farm to school program isn't going to be significant, but it's important for you to keep in mind that if you're working in the school environment, that your school food authority at the local level or whoever is implementing the actual meal program has to also answer to this federal overlay of that authority. So, and something else that happens that actually has come up in federal law is that can be a support for the farm to school programs is that there is a geographic preference option that the school food authorities who are actually implementing the program can use a geographic preference to make local foods more competitive in the federal procurement process. So there's some federal regulations that govern how, like to make sure that there's a competitive bidding process and to make sure that schools are using funds wisely and getting the best bang for their buck, really. We want to make sure that, that these public funds that are being used for school nutrition programs are getting the best benefit for our children and that our public funds are being used wisely. And what this geographic preference offers is it gives schools some ability to develop more of a relationship with local producers. And one of the great things is that also the federal law recognizing that, different local school districts may have a different geographic region that they're working with. Some people may have the benefit of having a local farm in their community that they can do business with. Other school districts may be in a more remote area and may need to travel further to find a local farmer or producer that can provide food. And the great thing about this federal law is that the geographic preference piece lets the school district define what that geographic preference or that area is, in which they can provide that extra bidding, a competitive edge to the local producers. And there's more information in this resource about that. And we also, the Public Health Law Center also has some other resources just about the federal child nutrition programs that if you're interested in learning more about that, can provide you with a kind of a real foundation on that. But anyway, just keeping in mind that the federal regulations and that piece is at play when you're looking at school food. And then there's also the State School Food Authority, which I mentioned earlier is the Kansas Department of Education. And basically the Kansas Department of Education is more closely involved in kind of oversight and supervision of the federal program and making sure that the benefits and the resources that are available through the federal program are distributed and made available appropriately to individual school districts. And then really where I think that so much of the work happens, and especially with farm to school programs, the local school food authority is really where the rubber meets the road. I mean, the school food authority is in the business of making things happen in local schools and local school districts and really figuring out how different meals and food programs are made available to children in a real practical, hands-on way. And so while you have to be aware of these other federal and state entities that may be involved, I think that so much of what happens and some of the really innovative and creative things that have happened with Farm to School happen at the local level. And I think that can be really empowering and that we can learn a lot from the experiences of people around, schools around Kansas that have done this, and then also there's some great resources from other states and around the country. One thing that I do just want to mention is that, as Natasha mentioned earlier, that there is this preemption bill that is being discussed in the Kansas State Legislature right now, HB 2595, and so what we're talking about today is really based on the current state of law in Kansas. And I am not a real expert in HB 2595. I've been involved in a few conversations about it, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Quite honestly, as things are being negotiated at the Kansas Legislature, right now, if HB 2595 is passed, what impact, if any, it will have on the federal regulations, because really the state law can't preempt the federal law, and so to the extent that any of that language that is in this HB 2595 includes some preemptive language, to the extent that it can impact the federal school nutrition programs and some of these existing federal regulations, I think that impact is likely limited, although as I understand the current language of that bill, it is very broad and pretty vague, and so it remains to be seen. So I just I just want to include that caveat that there's some possible changes that or conversations maybe that may be happening if this bill passes, and just to pay attention to it, but also from the K through 12 school environment perspective, to keep in mind that the federal regulatory framework is still at play even if the HB 2595 does pass for schools that are involved in the federal child nutrition program. I mean, if a school is not involved in the federal child nutrition program, then the school wouldn't have to be responsive to those federal laws. But there are very few schools that I've heard of that are not involved. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. So you're recognizing that there is this law that is or this proposed bill that is in the works. There's some specific areas of Kansas laws and policies that our new resource goes over. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I just wanted to kind of highlight some different things that are discussed and just encourage you to go and check out the resource and get some more information. So there's a small purchase threshold for local school districts, and what this includes is there may be different requirements for bids and contracts as far as, again, that like competitiveness and the transparency of the bids and contracting process, depending on how big the contract or purchase of food is. And so there's a lot of details, but these are things that your school food authority at the local level is very well aware of, because this is really getting into how they do their business and how they are able to function and get food on the table for kids to eat. But the small purchase threshold is something that could come into play and could actually be a useful tool when you're thinking about farm to school initiatives and contracts, because many times, especially getting started, some of the farm to school programs, as far as I understand, can be a little smaller scale, especially if you're working with a smaller local producer. And so the small purchase threshold might lessen some of the administrative burden that applies to, for these kind of smaller contracting processes. Another component under Kansas law that might come into play is the resident bidder preference. And now, Natasha mentioned this briefly in the farm to agency discussion earlier, and basically the same considerations apply to schools. This state law can make bids from a bidder living within the school district more competitive than those living, outside of the state. I think that there's some parallels here with that geographic preference piece that I mentioned earlier under federal law. Then there's the locally grown unprocessed agricultural products, and also, which is similar to what Natasha mentioned. And then it's always important to keep in mind the food safety requirements. And so for a school perspective, there's the federal food safety standards for school food require schools to follow a food safety plan, which is based on federal, and it's a mouthful, hazard analysis and critical control point principles, or I think HACCP, I think there's a way to say it. But anyway, there are certain food safety requirements for school kitchens to make sure that they follow to meet the federal requirements. And then there are also state laws under Kansas state law, certain requirements for a licensed kitchen that needs to follow to meet food safety requirements. And so school kitchens definitely fit under that. And so when you're thinking about bringing farm to school produce into the kitchen environment, there could be considerations there. But many of these things, when you're talking about fresh produce and things, it is just how business is done. I mean, these kinds of laws and policies shouldn't be anything that's surprising. And just to there are some misconceptions, though, at times about some of the food safety requirements. I know that I've had conversations with some people, I don't think in Kansas, but in some other places around the country, about whether or not GAP certification is required. So, and GAP is GAP, or Good Agricultural Practices. And that is a certain certification designation, I think, that comes through USDA that basically just kind of like provides a stamp of approval that certain food safety and food tracking practices are put into play. But GAP itself is not specifically a requirement. It's not a legal requirement, and sometimes people get confused about that. So there doesn't need to be any kind of legal, any certification, GAP certification that is a requirement for school food or for farm to school products. But at the store and at the same time, having good food handling practices and having good record keeping about where food comes from. All of these things are an important part of a farm to school program, because in the very unlikely event that something happens, if you have good records, then it's easy to find out where the problem is and how to track that and address anything that might come up from a food safety perspective. And kind of on a related note, I just want to mention that food safety, from in some ways local produce and like with products and food items that are coming from producers that that you have a relationship with, and sometimes some of the food safety issues that might pop up from like a bigger processing facility or from cilantro that comes from a foreign country, or some of these like crazy stories that we hear of in the press. At a local level and with these kinds of farm to school initiatives, I haven't heard of any kind of food safety issues that have come up with them. And my expectation is that because you have more of a relationship with those producers, that the likelihood that if there was some kind of a problem with a food item, it would be a lot easier to manage with food from a farm to school program than from food that comes from a distant location that you don't really know much about. So just wanted to give you some encouragement not to be too worried about that, but just to take procedures that are in line with how your school food authority will be doing their operations regardless. So one of the things in this resource that we do about, for local communities or advocates who are interested in pursuing or expanding their farm to school initiatives, and so one is, issuing a request for information, and which is really about trying to get information about where food is coming from and where some of the local producers might be located, so that you can target your efforts and find some opportunities. Because I think that with the Farm to School initiative, it's finding a producer that can help meet the school's needs. Again, I mentioned the geographic preference as a tool, and actually, a resource that schools can use to cultivate and provide a competitive edge for local food. So that's definitely a good step to take. The local purchasing preference policy is something that at this point schools can do, and as long as it's consistent with the federal regulations and state law as we currently know it, local purchasing preference policy can really help to elevate and prioritize that approach to working with local producers. Another recommendation that the report goes over is splitting food service contracts, and this gets into that the threshold piece I talked about earlier, as far as whether or not, and sometimes food contracts or for food purchases can be quite large. Schools are feeding a lot of children, but if there is one area of a contract that is specifically better suited for a local producer, sometimes schools can, or school food authorities can split their contracts in so that the contract for a specific locally produced item may be separated out and may then fall under that small contract threshold, and it can help to ease some of the administrative burden there. Another thing I think that's just important to keep in mind, as this next item says, is just how to, if your school is working with a food service management company, to have conversations and possibly include in your contract with the food service management companies different pieces around farm to school programs and local food procurement. I know that a number of schools, because of just changes in how kitchen operations are established or the resources that schools have for cooking scratch cooking are more limited, and so some schools work with food service management companies, and so a lot of, if you're working with a food service management company, your school's food program is really going to be governed through what that contract is and what the language in your contract is with the food service management company. And so if you wanted to include a farm to school initiative or increase local food procurement, you would need to include that in your contract with the food service management company. Another component is including qualitative factors with your request for proposals, and this gets into the weeds a little bit, but it's like there's bidding, and then there's requests for proposals, and requests for proposals can include as opposed to just like a number crunching game, like who can offer the cheapest tomatoes, and then having that person win the bid. A request for proposal can include some other components, and so it's some more qualitative factors that could really benefit a farm to school program. So talking about, like maybe having some demonstrations, or like featuring the farmer, or or having maybe trying to include the provision of a certain food item with a curriculum or educational goal, or some things like that. I mean, I think that schools can be kind of creative around that, but the request for proposal process and including these qualitative factors can be a way to try to bring a different layer of interest and opportunity to farm to school efforts. And then finally, just looking at providing technical assistance and financial support to small-scale producers. I mean, if you just think about a small farmer and just the challenges they may have in making sure that they have a market for their produce, and if they're going to make the investment to expand, because they are wanting to provide more food to an agency or to a school. I mean, it's good to have those conversations early on. Let the farmers know what your capacity or your need may be, and give them the confidence that they can take that next step and expand, or maybe explore some new produce. Because it'll fit your menu and some of your nutritional goals. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it back to Natasha.
Great. So really quickly, we did have the last section is on farm to preschool and childcare, and I just, we cited in the resource some thoughts about kind of the lay of the land in Kansas, that we were really excited to kind of map that out for you all through partnerships not only with the foundation, but also with Kansas Action for Children. And so we have a few resources to really lay out what does the childcare structure look like in Kansas, and within that resource, as well as the resource that we're highlighting today, it talks about childcare center food requirements. And so there's a lot of opportunity to insert locally sourced items within the existing licensing requirements for childcare centers. And so the resource just highlights those and establishes just a few recommendations. And the reason that this is such a smaller section is because this is a kind of emerging opportunity in Kansas as well as in other states to work on things like local purchasing preference, geographic preference, and then using this kind of soft purchase threshold, which is for the centers who are receiving funding from another federal nutrition program that I won't go into today, but there is some discussions related to that farm to child care. And one of the things we'll just say is that for the farm to child care setting, it's often a smaller setting to start in versus the schools that could be larger and have a higher need. And so this is an opportunity for those efforts that might not have a lot of local sources of food to really start small and make those connections and really do some experiments on what works and what doesn't work with local sourcing. And so we really think that the farm to child care effort could really be part of that. And so we have other resources that we're going to develop to help support your efforts in Kansas, including this other federal program, the Child and Adult Care Food Program. We're actually looking into creating a Kansas-specific resource to help really navigate the ins and outs of that and really incorporate local food sourcing into that resource, as well as just a one-pager that we already have available to help kind of get your efforts started in Kansas. And so the resource does kind of highlight the examples for the farm to child care setting, and at the same time, I think there are a lot of opportunities to expand those efforts as new opportunities emerge. All right, with that, I am going to pass the baton off to Ashley, who is the State Policy Director at KC Healthy Kids. Prior to that, she worked at the Greater Kansas City list doing advocacy work, and so she's had a lot of really phenomenal experience, hands-on experience, and looking at this kind of spectrum of farm to institution work, and has some wonderful kind of hands-on advocacy recommendations and opportunities to highlight. So with that, I will pass it off to Ashley.
Great, thanks, Natasha.
As she mentioned, my name is Ashley Jones-Weisner. I'm State Policy Director at KC Healthy Kids. And KC Healthy Kids is a nonprofit located in Kansas City that focuses on reducing childhood obesity and does so through partly through addressing policy change that increase access to healthy foods. And I just put this kind of quick one sentence from our mission statement so that you can see that one of our goals is to address state policy change, particularly as it impacts food deserts through policy issues of distribution and access to healthy retail. So KC Healthy Kids has a program side, which includes our Farm to School Academy and some of our youth advocacy initiatives, which I'll speak more about in just a little bit. And then also a policy team inside, which I'm a part of. So you might say, why in the world would a nonprofit be looking at statewide and local advocacy work? That seems kind of strange. But when you dig into the weeds a little bit, it becomes really apparent quickly how much policy impacts and impacts through either helping or hurting the work that a lot of us do across the state, whether we're a part of an institution like a school or we're a part of a nonprofit organization. So one of the most important things that I think that we're doing across the state and others are doing as well is building the capacity of both advocates doing local and statewide policy work and also producers simultaneously. And so let me spell that out just a little bit more. So the importance of developing capacity of advocates comes from doing things to kind of address the barriers to access to retail institutional purchasing. And those are things like the cost of food. Kansas has the highest sales tax rate in the nation on food, and that has a direct impact on families, of course, but also on purchasing. So the ability for schools and childcare centers and the like, their ability to afford fresh, healthy food for their constituents and children. So as as Natasha mentioned, some of the statewide work that we're doing right now is around both trying to reduce sales tax on food or eliminate it. And then we also simultaneously have this bill 2595 that addresses nutrition standards that has a lot of unintended consequences as it relates to what local governments and municipalities can do in terms of incentivizing or trying to provide healthy food. And we just received word literally like 10 minutes before I hopped on this webinar that bill will be up for debate on the House of Representatives floor tomorrow in Kansas. So if any of you are interested in getting some more information on that, or would be so kind as to email your local representative and say and talk a little bit about how that might impact your work, definitely email me afterwards, and I'm happy to provide you with that information to help educate your elected officials. So there's a real importance of tracking, as you can see, tracking and trying to weigh in on statewide advocacy work in the state of Kansas. And so we have really tried to focus on building the capacity of nonprofits and other interested individuals in doing that. But at the same time that we work on those policy tools at the statewide and local level, it's also really important that we keep an eye on producers. So right now here in Kansas, while you may hear or know that we are the breadbasket of the nation, the focus for production for producers isn't on what they call specialty crops, which would be veggies and fruit. What we're known for producing here in Kansas are things like wheat, milo, etc. And so while that's well and great, the reality is right now in Kansas, if I were to wave my magic wand, which would be awesome, and all of these institutions and schools, across Kansas would suddenly have the ability to source local and serve fresh fruits and vegetables. The reality is we don't have enough. We don't produce enough here in Kansas for that to actually happen. So while we're working on these policies to address this, it's important that we're helping those producers to scale up and the producers will produce what they can sell. It's a supply and demand issue, right? So the more that we can work on local policies that encourage the purchase of local foods, which is what this resource does, the more we can see producers wanting to scale up and feel comfortable, being able to provide the amount and the quantity that local institutions might need for their cafeterias. So this farm institution research really, and this brief really serves as a sort of template and a starting place for organizations across the state to start using and work together on this issue. So I wanted to give you an example of, related to that, some local level advocacy work that we did to address that. When I first started at KHF Kids, we were trying to figure out why exactly farmers markets in Wyandotte County, why there were only 4. So we were trying to increase access to healthy retail in an area of Wyandotte County that has numerous food deserts. And so what we wanted to do was we started trying to say, okay, that's just kind of strange for farmers markets in the entire county. So what we uncovered, though, was that farmers markets in policy at the local level, and so code and dealing with planning and zoning, farmers markets fell into the same bucket as all of retail. So farmers markets were beholden to the same planning and zoning, parking, permitting requirements as like a CVS or a Walmart, which is obviously problematic for a variety of reasons. It's really costly, and there's just a lot of paperwork, and policy is really hard to understand, and for a lot of neighborhood groups or individuals that are interested in starting up a farmers market, it just seemed too cumbersome, and they didn't really know where to start. And so we worked with the Public Health Law Center to put together a farmers market toolkit that looked at addressing those policy barriers similar to what this farm institution brief does. And we were able to take that resource, again, and use it as a template to try and address that with local government elected officials and key stakeholders. To what eventually happened was we passed an ordinance amendment that would make it easier for farmers markets to start up in Wyandotte County. So our plan is to use this farm institution brief in a similar way as we did the farmers market. So I just wanted I'll walk through really briefly at KCLP Kids some of the areas that we're working on around farm to school, and talk a little bit about what we're hearing from the ground and how we will use this resource. So at KCLP Kids, we have a farm to school academy, and it does a variety of different things that are equally wonderful in my book. But do everything from providing tasting at local metro schools to help kids get introduced to fresh veggies and food and the taste and texture in a way that they might not get at home or in different settings. We have recently started a food service directors collaborative, so it's bringing together different food service directors to kind of talk about what the issues are and best practice ideas for incorporating fresh, healthy food into cafeterias, and also engaging faculty and staff. So it's doing a variety of things and moving at a pretty fast and furious pace, which is great, to address farm to the school in the Kansas City metro. We also have, as a resource on our website, it's called Grow a Garden, and it's a curriculum that can be used. That is based on a lot of what we've heard in terms of frustrations that different faculty and food service directors have. So right now in Kansas and across the nation, you're hearing a lot of things like, we don't even have 10 or 15 minutes to give our kids recess. How in the world are we going to get them out in a school garden? Just how does that work? So what this Grow a Garden curriculum does is it walks you through not only how to access resources to start a schoolyard garden or even a community garden. A lot of the information in that curriculum can be used a variety of different ways. But also, what could you do in that schoolyard garden that could help you meet some of your other needs as a teacher? So that curriculum incorporates some of the Common Core standards and other requirements that teachers need for their classroom, so that, you think about gardening, it touches everything, science, math, so there's some really nice, simple pieces of curriculum that you could use in your schoolyard garden that would help your teachers, or if you are a teacher, help you to actually meet those needs throughout your day. So there's the Farm and School Academy, Grow a Garden, and I want a curriculum that's available on our website if you'd like more information. In both of those areas are, there have been things that we've heard in working around both that I think that this farm to institution brief and information is really going to help us. So one of the misconceptions that we've heard from food service directors and also from some receiving sites across the state of Kansas is that they really feel like, they're trying to provide a service and do their job on a day-to-day basis, and getting into policy is hard. But one of the biggest barriers that they're up against is thinking that, having this mentality that they have to buy all the tomatoes that they need for the day or the week from the same person. So, some of the bigger companies like Sodexo or some of the purchasing companies make it really easy for them just to check a box, get what they need, and call it a day. So while that's all well and good, it's not necessarily true that you need to get all of your tomatoes or whatever the product is from the same source. So Mary kind of alluded to it a little bit, but they do have the option to do split purchase contracts, and so that's something that we're going to work on educating more food service directors on. That they do have the option to do that. They also, one of the biggest barriers that they say is just knowing where they can get that local produce, and that's something that we're working with our partners at the Kansas Rural Center and other organizations across the state to address. Particularly as I think there's some low-hanging fruit, pun intended, around connecting local producers with summer feeding sites, because during the summer, obviously, fruits and vegetables are in abundance, and summer feeding sites, summer meal sites across the state need smaller amounts than schools do. And from a producer perspective, often, providing the amount or the quantity that a whole school district needs, or even in just one school, is a little overwhelming. But chipping away and maybe just addressing the needs of the summer meal site at a school, summer meal sites are often at schools, is a little bit more palatable. And my thought is perhaps that'll help them, those producers, then to develop those relationships, and also gain the confidence I think that they need to see what that relationship would look like in terms of scaling up to maybe doing summer meals there for a year or two and then scaling up to doing more. So, and then the last misconception that we hear a lot is just using a school garden. Like a lot of them don't. A lot of the misconceptions come related to food safety. So you hear a lot of food service directors or teachers say, I don't grade or curriculum or for classroom activities, but I don't want to get in trouble, incorporating these cherry tomatoes into the classroom or into the school meal. Just some misconceptions around what you can and can't do related to food safety. So those are just a kind of a preview of a few of the things we're hearing on the ground across the state of Kansas from a variety of different stakeholders that we're hoping can be addressed through using this really great document. So we're hoping we can overcome the barriers and ensure that our partners across the state have the resources they need to implement farm to institution policies successfully. And that is all I have. I'm happy to take any questions too.
All right, before we turn it over for questions, thank you, Ashley. And before we turn it over for questions, I just wanted to make sure everyone knows where to find the resource. It's on our Food Policy Council page as well as on our campus page. And then I would be remiss, since I have you all on the call, if I didn't highlight that we have all of these other resources related to healthy food access and the food system, specific to food councils,
farmers markets, the ones actually that grew out of our work with Ashley and Casey Healthy Kids, and the issues they were having with their local farmers markets and the policies that were impeding expanding the farmers market structure in Wyandotte County. We also have things related to local procurement. This includes some efforts related to the Wyandotte Shepherdess that I referenced, and a land bank resource. And these can all be found on a specific page related to Kansas resources. And as all of you who have worked with the Public Health Law Center know, we are constantly in a feedback loop related to these resources. We want to make sure these resources are working on the ground. And so we're going to stay in touch with Ashley if she's working on the ground with this new farm to institution resource to make sure that it is meeting the needs of everyone that she's working with, and to identify opportunities to make it better and adjust it as it's being used on the ground. And that's, the way we've really been working with a lot of our other resources that are specific to the Kansas context. All right, and with that, we'll go ahead and open it up for questions if there are any.
That's great. Thanks, Natasha. This is Mary, and I'm going to field questions. And I've got one or two here. There's one, and while people are thinking about it, go right ahead and add things in. But it's a question for you, Natasha. And basically, I think that the gist of it is so there's all these federal requirements for the, farm to school and the K-12 food nutrition programs. Do these federal regulations apply or impact any of these child care, farm to child care efforts?
That's a great question. There are issues related to the food system and the child care environment that there are policies that impact the child care environment, but it is not regulated in the same way that schools are. So there is not a federal program that all child care facilities have access to in the same way that they have access to the school nutrition program. There is a child and adult care food program, which CACFP, that some providers actually opt into. So it's a voluntary program, and in that program, it's a reimbursement program. So there are requirements that impact farm to child care, and we go over those impacts in our resource. But there are not, as there are child care providers that are not taking advantage of that program in Kansas. And in addition, there are licensing requirements that we go into in our resources that impact the food environment for providers in Kansas. But again, it's not the same impact that the food environment is regulated at the school level on either the federal and the state level. And in some ways, that's a real opportunity for this work, because there are some real opportunities to experiment and really kind of scale up the use of local sourced products in that environment prior to or during the advocacy or conversations with the schools and with the other state and local agencies.
Great. Thanks, Natasha. And then there's one other question. I think it's more directed towards the farm to school and the K-12 area, and it has to do with a question about using funds, from the school food program or the federal child nutrition program for some of these, farm to school or gardening activities. I think specifically about the school gardening activities. And so basically, the answer is that yes, indeed, you can use money from the school food authorities fund or the school food programs account for school gardening activities. Again, this is where the federal regulations come into play, and where USDA, there's federal regulations, that require certain accounting and management of funds. But the school gardens are recognized as a really valuable and important component of the school nutrition programs, and I think USDA and federal regulations recognize the value that those initiatives, in addition to the farm to school, with other local producers, can provide to the school. And so I know that some schools can, have used, if they're doing more of a production-based school garden initiative, can use the funds from the school food authority for purchasing seeds and some equipment, even for cultivating the school garden and initiative as part of the school food program. So it can be used, those funds can be used to support those gardening activities in addition to clearly the farm to school, the relationships or contracts with local producers separate from a school garden are definitely fall under that allowance, but the school garden piece does as well.
And I would add to that, and can I add to that? Sure. There is also a specific memo from USDA about how funds from the CHF program can be used to support a garden that's located in a childcare facility receiving the funds from CHF. And so there is some flexibility there for the reimbursement to that nutrition program as well. So there's a lot of support for these efforts from the federal level.
Great. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. I want to just give Natasha and Ashley an opportunity if you have any final thoughts to share. If not, thank you all for spending your lunch hour with us, and we look forward to hearing your feedback and experience with this new resource. And again, Natasha and I look forward to seeing many of you hopefully later this month when we are in Wichita for the HCI convening. Hope you all have a good day and good rest of your week.
Thank you.